Hello everyone, welcome to our second H.U.U character profile. Today, we will be discussing the origin and life story of Mr. Mass, the Hero Reborn. Without further ado, let's get started. Long ago, humanoids and humans alike frequently possessed extraordinary abilities. Abilities which, by today's standards, would be considered superhuman. Such abilities and abnormalities were common due to the presence of the all-powerful one, Element Bender. At this point in the universe's development, Element Bender wanted to test the limits of human and human-like species. Limits meaning the most power any given individual could contain without succumbing to corruption and the effects of power. Impressively, nearly all species throughout the universe passed this test. They had proven their willpower, and, as a result, did not have the ability to wield powers removed from their DNA. Only one species was deemed unworthy: humans. The earliest of humans could not handle the power given to them, and because of this, the entire human race was decimated to the point of extinction. Millions of years later, Element Bender reconstructed the human race. Yet, it would take another 2 million years of evolution before any human could be entrusted with the abnormal, the superhuman. Eventually, the time came when, once again, human evolution would be put to the test. Element Bender granted the human species with potential for great power, but this time, not to our species as a whole. Instead, Element Bender selected the single most worthy human alive. If he couldn't handle the power, no one could. This man, this one selfless, heroic man, was named Antonio Martins. One seemingly normal day in the country of H.U.U, or Hero United Country, Antonio awoke with the strangest of feelings, like he wasn't himself anymore. It's an indescribable feeling, really, but he could tell one thing for certain: something had changed. He rushed to the office. On his way, he thought to himself, maybe if I go to work, I could get my mind off this strange feeling. As the day progressed, Antonio began to feel stranger and stranger. His body began to change. His hands would occasionally emit a sort of blue energy, like a force field. Suddenly, a force field erupted from his body and knocked over all 10 cubicles in the room. He knew he wasn't safe there. Antonio left the office in a hurry to be sure he wasn't being followed. The last thing he needed on his mind was his boss yelling at him for causing damage to the office. As much as Antonio wanted his life to return to normal, deep down, he knew it would never be the same. That night confirmed this. Just around the corner, a bank robbery was in progress, and Antonio had practically walked right into it. It's almost as if fate, or some godlike entity, had a hand in this encounter, as if Antonio was being tested. He could have ran. He could have called the police, but he didn't. Something came over him. His typical instincts and impulses, those of the average person, rendered obsolete in that split second. In an absence of thought, Antonio steadily crept forward. With each step, his stride elongated, his rash confidence growing. Antonio opened the door and faced the robbers. The robbers, who were facing a crowd of civilians lying on the floor, thrust their bodies around 180 degrees, at a blinding speed, afraid of what they might see. But the robbers didn't find themselves facing the police, but an average man. Antonio appeared that way, anyway. However, underestimating Antonio would be a near fatal mistake for the bank robbers. After being threatened by the robbers to stand down, Antonio refused. Then, he received his final warning. Antonio stood in silence, though was shaking in fear. Just one small mistake, and Antonio would be killed on the spot. One of the robbers pointed his pistol to Antonio's forehead. He snarled and pulled the trigger. Though this happened incredibly fast, Antonio seemed to view the world in slow motion. The shot was fired, the bullet just inches from Antonio's face. But then, something amazing happened. Not only did Antonio unleash yet another force field, but in the process, he flung the marksman halfway across the room. The other bank robbers took shots of their own, but not a single shot could penetrate Antonio's field of transparent blue energy. Startled yet determined, Antonio ran forward. His focus diminished, so did his force field. Though powerful, Antonio had little control over his new powers. As the final bank robber withdrew his weapon, Antonio's reflexes kicked in again. This time, he did not produce a defensive bubble of energy, but instead, he reached forward, piercing the robber's chest, and from his hand came a wave of pure energy, which packed the punch of a metal baseball bat swung at high speed. That robber, along with the others, admit defeat and was taken into custody. From that day on, Antonio Martins would be known as a hero. All seemed well until the government began to take interest in Antonio's seemingly superhuman feats. To prevent any interaction with the government, Antonio adopted the title Mr. Mass as a cover name for his true, secret identity, and went into hiding a few miles outside of town. Even still, on occasion, Mr. Mass would travel back into town and fight crime. A few years later, Dr. Magma, formerly Jonathan Lynx, formed a new team for superheroes. Mr. Mass was the first recruit to be invited to this team. He happily accepted, and from that day on, the team would be known as H.U.U, or Hero United Universe. For the next few decades, Mr. Mass would live not as an outcast running from the law, but as a well-respected, widely known superhero. In his days with H.U.U, Mr. Mass assisted in defeating numerous supervillains, and would become one of the greatest heroes of all time, certainly proving the worth of the human species.